Welcome to class number 3 in our study in the life of Christ. I hope you're enjoying our class materials so far, and I hope you're enjoying the discussion boards and all that comes with the class. I'm looking forward to what we're going to study today because I think it's going to be really good in providing some very healthy and needed perspective into the world that Jesus came into. If you think about the Gettysburg Address, it's probably something that a lot of you had to memorize when you were in elementary school or high school. That Gettysburg Address goes like this: 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Then it goes on to say that now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any other nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met here on a great battlefield of that war. One of the reasons why that statement was so important is, and one of the reasons why your teachers probably made you memorize it, is because it gave you a peek into the world that was around during the Civil War, and also especially during the time of Abraham Lincoln. One of the things that we know is that they had just got done with that war, the Great Civil War. It tested the nation. The nation had been going through a very difficult time, and so this was almost a speech of freedom and a speech of excitement for the people. And so when you learn that, it helps you to understand better the type of world the people were living in. And that's the reason why you study history in general. One of the reasons why you have a history class all throughout high school and elementary school, and even when you get into a college setting, is because it helps you to better understand how we got where we are today. And it helps make sure that you understand the transitions that we went through, the high points and the low points, to understand where we got today. And the same thing as we're going to study today happens as we study the Gospels. That if we don't fully understand the world that Jesus came into, then a lot of the things that Jesus had to deal with, really won't make much sense. For instance, if you understand a lot about the Roman culture, it will make sense a lot as to why Jesus had to go through what he did, whether it be the trials or even his persecution being physical with the beatings and the cross and the nailing to the cross, and all of how they went about doing it, the amount of lashes that they gave him, why they made him carry a cross. All of these things are very significant to help us understand a little bit about Jesus. Also, if you look through the Gospels, one of the things that you've probably already noticed, and we're going to study even further, is that probably one of the greatest things that Jesus had to go against, and one of the problems that he had to deal with probably more than any other problem, was the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the religious leaders. And these were a group of people that understood things. They had great knowledge, but they were also steeped in a lot of the culture of that day. They were trying to be very much self-promoters and pushers of their own agenda. And so a lot of these made for a very difficult time for Jesus to come into this world. And so again, if we can really understand the historical, the social, the cultural, and the religious setting of Jesus's day, that he came into when he came in and began his ministry here in this world, it'll help us to understand his life a lot better, and especially why he was needed, especially during this time. And so over the next, this video and the next one, we are going to cover those things: the historical, the social, the cultural setting that Jesus came into. And so this one today, we're going to be focusing on the historical setting of Jesus. Now, for some of you, this really excites you because you love history. And so if you're a history person, you're really going to enjoy what we're going to study. But if you're not a history person, you're just going to bear with us and work through this. But I think you'll find it very interesting, but you'll also get a better understanding of the type of world that Jesus came into. So we're going to divide this into 4 parts, okay? These are the 4 parts that we're going to be studying through the historical setting that leads up to Jesus. Number 1, the Persian period. Number 2, the Greek period. Number 3, the time where the Maccabees were revolting and the Jews were trying to get their independence. And then we'll focus on the Roman period. And the Roman period, of course, will run right up into the time of Jesus. And so we're going to look at Israel's history for a little bit. We're going to look at people such as Alexander the Great, who you maybe have heard of, Judas Maccabees, Caesar, of course, Herod the Great, Pontius Pilate. And we're going to also talk about other words that are extremely important that are going to be valuable for you to remember for later assessments, like Hellenization, the Seleucids, Ptolemy. We're also going to have to remember a little bit about the Roman rule in Palestine. So let's start going through these four parts that we first talked about. And what this is, what we're covering right now is actually before Jesus ever came to this earth. Now, as we talked about last class, Jesus was still around. He was a thought. It was with God from the very beginning. It says in John 1 that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So even though Jesus wasn't here yet, the plan was for him to be about soon. So just keep that in mind. So we're going to pick up about 539 BC, and so of course BC means before Christ, and we're going to pick up with the Persian period. Now, the Persians during this time, beginning around 539, you'll notice this as the Old Testament closes, were led by their Persian ruler Cyrus the Great. They were under Cyrus the Great. And the Babylonians at this time had been keeping God's people, the children of Israel, and of course we know them, the people that Moses led out of Egypt and to the Promised Land, and now through a series of kings and prophets, judges, they are finding themselves under the Babylonian rule. And their temple was somewhere they couldn't even go to, that they had built, and they had been distanced from their temple in Jerusalem. And so they were technically, under the Babylonian time, they were in exile. So Cyrus comes about, and Cyrus was quite the reformer and quite a encouraging sight for a lot of these people to see. And Cyrus, and this is something very important to remember, Cyrus allowed these exiled people to return to their homeland and to worship God. So, of course, I told you it's great news for the Jews that had been wanting for so long to be able to worship and to do what they wanted to do. Now they're actually able to go back to their temple. So, after the Persians and Cyrus, remember Cyrus the Great was the one that helped take down the Babylonians. That was around 539. Cyrus then allowed the Jews to return to their hometown and rebuild the city and the temple. And what we can understand about history, that there was close to 42,000 people that returned to rebuild that temple. And the reason why we know that, if you turn over into your Old Testament to the book of Ezra chapter 1 through 6, it will show us that. So that is what we'll enter into as what we'll call the second temple period. So the Old Testament, what it ends with is this. The Old Testament history ends with this return. As you close your Old Testament up, you're going to notice that the Cyrus the Great allowed them to leave the Babylonians, gave them that opportunity, let them rebuild their temple, and this is what, again, is called the Second Temple period. And that's it for your Old Testament. Now, there's in between what some people have called your Old Testament and your New Testament. Some people called this the period of silence. Well, it was anything but silent, as we're about to find out. In fact, one of the things you may know, if you are a history buff or interested in this at all, that the time between the Old Testament and the New Testament was actually very, very lively. And in fact, there's tons of movies that are illustrating what has gone on during this time. And one of the main key players between this time, between the Old Testament and the New Testament, was a guy by Alexander the Great, a guy by the name of Alexander the Great. And he's going to be important for you to remember because he's helped set up a lot of things as we begin this Greek period. So now, during this time between the Old and New Testament, we still haven't gotten to the time of Jesus yet. We're about to shift from the Persian Empire and the Persian period to the Greek period. So let's talk about one of the most remarkable leaders of the ancient world, a guy by the name of Alexander the Great. His father was named Philip II, and his father was a very well-known leader and a great leader as well, as far as unifying the people and developing armies. And they didn't just develop armies to where they would stay in their homeland. They would move from place to place, so they're very mobile. But his father was assassinated and killed. And so then comes to the throne Alex. And his assassination happened around 336 BC. Alexander took over both his father's throne, but he also took over his father's desire of conquest. And what I mean by conquest is this. Number one, he wanted to have a whole lot of power. And he was a very smart guy. He was very ambitious. He had an army, and his army spread. And his army took over a huge area. In fact, if you look on page 96 of your textbook, one of the things that you'll see in that map is the areas where Alexander came about and kind of took over the area. And so in a very short time, he conquered pretty much all of the Eastern Mediterranean, Syria, Egypt, Persia, Babylon, and he was only around 30-something years old, and he already had done all of these things. So he's quite the leader. Now, one of the things that we have to remember and is very important to point out about his life is not only was he a military genius, but he was also huge in this process, the process of Hellenization. I want to use that word again because it's going to be important that you remember this. Hellenization. The word Hellas means Greece, and Hellenization refers to the spread of the Greek language and the Greek culture. So one of the things that Alexander wanted to do, he just didn't want to only just expand his territory. He wanted to expand the Greek culture. And again, we're in this Greek period here, so he's trying to expand the Greek influence on the rest of the world. And one of the reasons why this is significant is we still see it today, that there is a huge amount of influence by the Greek culture because of what Alexander the Great did. So Alexander the Great settled a lot of areas and empires within his area that he was ruling, and the Jews, one of the things that we see that they started to fall into this. We see that the Jews, very interestingly, actually did not resist Alexander's conquest. They were under Alexander, because I know you're probably wondering, well, what about God's people? What about the Jews? What happened to them and all of this? Well, one of the neat things about them is that they understood that, hey, while Alexander is quite the ambitious guy and he's wanting to expand his kingdom, we're still having independence. And our worship is in the temple is still fine. So their worship in the temple was not hindered in any way. But it still had an impact on the Jewish culture. And let's think about this for a second. Let's pause. Imagine if somebody came about, say, China came over to America and just took us over and put our culture, their culture in our everywhere we were. Now, they still allowed us to worship like we wanted to, and they allowed us to freely do what we normally do. We would get to a point, though, I think, where there would be some level of influence and obviously impact. Well, that starts to happen here because virtually every area that was inhabited by Israel started in God's people, the Jews, ended up being heavily influenced by the Greek culture. And so one of the most important things of Hellenization that happened was the emergence of the Greek language. And of course, one of the things that we have to remember and can't forget that the New Testament was, in fact, written in Greek. And I know maybe you will learn more about that in some of your classes, as far as, you know, what is how to understand the Greek in order to understand the culture, and how to understand the culture in order to better understand Christ. So the Greek language was something that was really developed strong during this time. So Alexander the Great, as we see, had a lot of conquest, and it went throughout the world, but then he died in 323. And after he died, there was a very big power struggle. And with a guy who's quite the ambitious leader like he was, there was nobody that really could fit the type of energy that he brought into this world. So here's what happened. If you look on page 98 of your text, if you have, of course, the book that we've been studying with, The Four Portraits of One Jesus, if you go to that book and you turn to page 98, One of the things that you're going to notice here is, I guess, where after Alexander the Great took off, what begins to happen. There was a conflict between four generals, eventually resulted in the establishment of two different dynasties. And the first one is the dynasty of the Ptolemies, was started in Egypt, which was near Alexandria, which is the capital of Egypt. And then there was the dynasty of the Seleucids, and this was started in Syria. And so during this time, the capital of Egypt, Alexandria, the capital of the Ptolemy Empire, developed and became a huge place of learning and education. And one of the great things that actually happened during this time was the establishment of the Septuagint. The Septuagint. This is a very important word to remember, and if you look at your abbreviation there of what this word means, the Septuagint was the Greek version of the Old Testament. So this was gave the Greeks a way for them to understand Scripture. And so it's kind of like if we didn't have a Bible in English and somebody came along and finally translated the Bible over into English for us, this would be a huge deal for us. So this was a very big deal for them. And the Septuagint became the primary Bible of actually the Jews and eventually the Christians, but also for those that were there during the Ptolemaic time. But then there was also constant war, obviously, because there were two different dynasties. It usually happens. No one can share that power like they need to. There became struggle between the Seleucids and the Ptolemaic Empire. And the Syrians failed over and over to gain control over Israel through Antiochus. And what we understand as we look down through history, Antiochus III's son came about, Antiochus IV, and he was released from Rome 14 years later. He returned to Syria, and he succeeded his brother as the ruler of the Seleucid Empire. So under Antiochus IV, Israel faced its greatest threat to survival ever. And he actually called himself Epiphanes. Now this is Antiochus IV. It's important to remember that he called himself Epiphanes, which means the manifested one or manifest one. And so a guy with obviously quite the arrogant personality would definitely make it difficult for you to live and to have your lifestyle that you want to have and to pursue your religion as you would like to. And so this is who he was. And so he brought Israel fully into his empire, and he turned it into what becomes known as a Hellenistic state. And as we talked about before, Hella means what? It was referring to Greece. So it was a very Greek state. And so the Hellenists were people who favored the adoption of Greek ideas. And so that's a very important thing to remember, is that the Hellenists were the people that favored the Greek ideas. So we started with the Persian period, we moved to the Greek period, and now we're about to move into what is called the Maccabean Revolt, or the history of the Maccabees, the time of the Maccabees. There were a lot of people that were the Israelites that realized that this Antiochus guy was getting out of control. He was threatening them, their culture, their lifestyle, more than anything, their religious freedom. So what they started to do was this. They started to rebel. And this rebellion broke out in the Judean village of Modin. And this began to happen, and was really started by a guy by the name of Mattathias. And one of the things I want you to know about him is he was a Syrian official, and at the time was ordered by a Syrian official to offer a pagan sacrifice. And so this guy refused to do it. And since he refused to do it, another Jew stepped forward to perform the rite. And this made him really mad. And one of the things that we know is he thought, well, obviously, this is how our culture is getting to the point of being, so he killed both the guys. And so he destroyed this, and then he left and ran to the hills. And in 166, this guy died, and he left his son, Judas, to lead what is called the Maccabean Revolt. And so some of you may have heard of Judas Maccabees. Judas Maccabees was the guy who has led the Maccabean Revolt. And Judas developed the Jews into almost like a guerrilla style type army, hiding in the trenches, and very smart when it becomes to war. And one of the things that's very interesting about this is there have been a lot of different attempts to make a movie about this area and about this time in history, but no one's actually gone through with it yet. It's quite the vicious things that they had to do. Maybe that's why, I don't know, but I would like to see it. But the Maccabees ended up ruling, and they liberated the people, and they liberated the temple and brought it back to where they can finally worship God again. So we went from the Persian Empire to the Greek Empire to the Maccabean Empire, where Judas Maccabees took over for his father, and he led this revolt, and he allowed God's people, his people, the Israel, to worship again in their temple. And they started this Jewish festival that a lot of you probably have heard of called Hanukkah, which means dedication. This was their festival to celebrate this time. So while the Maccabean revolt did in fact happen, the Seleucids, it ended the Seleucid domination of Israel during this time. And so now we're going to move into the Roman culture. And I know for a lot of people, when you think of Rome, you may think of the movie 300, you may think of the movie Troy, I don't know, you may be thinking a lot of different things, but they are known a lot of times during this time as being a very cruel, but they're also quite a genius group of people. And this period that we're about to cover will run from 63 BC, 63 years before Christ, to AD 135. And so this is the time where Jesus is coming into the world. And I want to just provide you a little bit of the history during this time so you can understand what Jesus had to go through. So you've got this guy by the name of Herod the Great, and he ruled as the king of the Jews under the Roman authority. And this was for about 33 years. And this is the guy who appears at the birth of Jesus. Now, I want you to read, if you will, take this time to flip over to Matthew chapter 2. If you'll flip over to Matthew chapter 2 and read verses 1 through 18 to get a little bit of an idea of the type of person that Herod the Great was. Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 18. All right, I'm pretty sure you're probably done by now reading. That was Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 18. So one of the things that you see happening here, Herod is the one that appears in the birth of Jesus. And from the start, he proved to be quite an interesting person. One of the things that is talked about of him, and this is one of the ways the book puts it, I think is a very good description. It says, Herod was a strange mix of clever and efficient as a ruler and a cruel tyrant. On one hand, he was distrustful, jealous, brutal, ruthlessly crushing any potential opposition. And it says because he was Idumean, which is Edomite, because he was an Edomite, the Jews never accepted him as their legitimate king and rejected him. And that infuriated him. And so one of the things that we know and we start to find out is that Herod, he had this very interesting relationship with the Jews, And it's that he wanted to be their king, and he wanted them to like him, but they just wouldn't. And for a guy that was very power hungry, and a guy that was a tyrant and a strange mix, as the book says, of clever and efficient, this really rubbed him the wrong way. This did not settle with him like he wanted it to happen. And so this was very difficult for him to stomach. Hey, I want people to like me. If you're a Seinfeld watcher, you may know what I'm talking about with George Costanza. He says, no, people have to like me. So he was this guy that he wanted everybody to like him. And so one person, though, said that, this was the Roman Emperor Augustus said this about Herod the Great. He said that he would rather be one of Herod's pigs than his own son. So that kind of tells you a little bit about the type of person that Herod was. So we think of Herod and we think extremely, extremely negative, but at the same time, he did protect the Judaistic ideas, and he wanted to gain favor with the Jews, and he actually even encouraged them to build their empires and to have their own places of worship and their synagogues. And so he really tried to establish that peace, just it never came across the way I think he really wanted it to do. So moving on, one of the things that we see is under Herod the Great, while there was obviously a little bit of difficulty there as far as a relational aspect, one of the things that we do know about them is that during this time, the economy was absolutely incredible. And the Roman frontier was given really strong edges and fortified. And during this time, Herod built a lot of theaters, a lot of amphitheaters, and there's another word that I think is kind of interesting, a hippodrome, which is an outdoor stadium for horse and chariot racings. If you've ever seen the movie Ben-Hur, that has maybe some interest to you. But so he really developed a lot of popular things like that. And so what ended up happening was there were some Jews that were what we'll call the upper class Jews that actually found a lot of interest and a lot of favor and in the ideas of him because he was playing into the arts and education. Then Herod died in 4 BC. Herod died in 4 BC. And so his dynasty starts to change. Now, we see that Herod, as you look on in the text, that he changed his will several times during his life. Part of it's because he had different wives, different children. But one of the most important people as we go on and study who proved to, I guess, be some of the most significant names during the Roman rule was not just a guy by the name of Herod, but a guy by the name of Pontius Pilate. A lot of you, of course, may remember Pontius Pilate. Pilate was the guy, of course, whose I guess it was under his administration that Jesus Christ was crucified. You also have other governors that are mentioned, Felix, Festus, and that's who Paul actually stood on trial before. And you have a guy another guy named Herod Antipas, which became a very well-known emperor and ruled for a short time. But there's a word that I want to focus on about this Roman Empire that began to happen around 31 BC. The guy by the name of Augustus, who came around at 31 BC, became the emperor, and the Roman Empire entered into a time of peace. And so this was right after Herod. There comes a guy by the name of Augustus. So this is important for you to remember. And he started something and had this peace that was known as Pax Romana. I want you to remember that. A time of peace that was known as Pax Romana. And what Pax Romana means, it means what would likely seem to mean Roman peace. And so he came about and really started to develop a place of peace and a place of rest for the people. And this was good because there was really not much stability during this time. And so he brought about stability for the Romans. He brought about stability for all people. And what ended up happening, because there was such peace, the church and Christianity, the followers of Christ, grew at a very, very alarming rate. And here's what's also interesting about this, is during the Pax Romana, under Augustus, when the growth was happening and all these things were taking place, part of the reason why Christianity also spread was because people were more mobile. And what happened was Augustus, during his reign, he developed a lot of roads and a lot of opportunities for travel, and so it was creating more opportunities. It's kind of like, I think about it in a way like social media. Social media can be an awful thing. But at the same time, social media, if we allow it to, can be a great thing for Christians. It can be a great thing for the church. And it can be used as something to spread and further the kingdom if Christians represent themselves in the right way. It's kind of like I tell our church, you can either do some wonderful, great things for the church on social media, or you can be the biggest hindrance for the church in Christianity on social media if you don't know how to use it properly. So these people actually knew how to use the roads, and so the Christians used these roads and used what they had and spread out to so many areas and grew Christendom. And went from town to town. Part of it, they had the roads to do it, preaching the gospel. And so it was really neat to see, obviously, the growth in all the things that they were able to do during this time. And so what I want to do for the next few minutes then, as we bring this a little bit to a close, is I want to do a little bit of reviewing with you, because I know that we covered a lot, and there's a lot of things that I obviously pointed out that were extremely important. Like I said, the main point of this class today was to help you and to help me to understand the world that Jesus was coming into. And when we understand the social, the historical, the religious setting of the time, it helps us to better understand the world that Jesus was coming into. And so we covered 4 main areas, and the 4 areas that we covered were the Persian Empire, the Greek period, the Maccabean/Jewish independence, and the Roman period. And as we went through this study, we looked at several influential people. The first guy with the Persian Empire that's going to be so important for you to remember is Cyrus the Great. Cyrus the Great was the ruler of the Persian Empire, and he allowed the Jews to go into their homeland and establish the temple. So he's going to be someone to remember. And then we know about 42,000 Jews took him up on that offer. And then right after him, there was a guy in the Greek period by the name of Alexander the Great. And Alexander the Great, kind of like his name suggests, he did some mighty wonderful things. When his father passed away, he took the throne, developed a huge army. They went to several different areas. They expanded, and one of the things that they became was just a strong unit of people. And one of the things that he did was this word that we talked about was Hellenization. Hellenization, which refers to the spread of the Greek language, but also the spread of the Greek culture. And then we went on to talk about the power struggle after Alexander the Great died. Remember, after Alexander the Great died, it divided into 2 different dynasties. One located in Egypt, and the other one located in Syria. That's Ptolemies and the Seleucids. The Ptolemies and the Seleucids were the 2 that were divided. And one of the things that we go on to see is during the time, one of the things that the Ptolemies did was that they helped get going the Septuagint. And the Septuagint, remember, was the Greek version of the Old Testament. And the Septuagint actually became used by the Jewish people, and eventually we also see for some of the Christians as well. Then we also went on to talk about the time of the Maccabees. And this was the Maccabean revolt. This was some of the Jews that kind of, the Israelites that were kind of like, hey, we're sick of being ruled by people like this. We're sick of being told what to do and how to do it. We're sick of other people's culture. So what they did is rebellion broke out. And it was really led by a guy by the name of Judas Maccabees, and he taught people how to fight. He taught people how to defend themselves. And so they were successful, and they liberated themselves from the people. And then during this time, of course, they had a celebration that was called Hanukkah, and the word Hanukkah means dedication. And the Maccabean revolt, what it also ended up doing was it ended this period of domination. Okay, then we went to the Greek Empire, which of course we talked about Herod the Great for a while, and he was kind of a little bit of an awkward leader in the fact that he was powerful, he was a tyrant, He was smart and clever guy, but the problem with him is he wanted people to like him, but they wouldn't like him. And he even had a tough time when Jesus, of course, was born, and he was showed his colors at times. But one of the things that he really wanted to do was to help the people, and he did economically. But the Christians just never fully bought in, the Jewish people and the Israelites never fully bought into him like he wanted them to do. And so he died around